Food Service is a network of community food projects across the country centred around the concept of social eating, working together to tackle food insecurity, as well as the internet-connected problems of food waste and social isolation. At the start of the pandemic, we had 7 branches operating a variety of community-led food projects. Now, 5 months in, the National Food Service Network is really coming into its own, with 15 branches across the UK and growing. We have come together quickly to share resources and support across the National Food Service Network. Existing branches have launched effective emergency food responses and replicated these systems of support elsewhere. Brand new branches have been set up in a matter of weeks. Communities in 11 cities across the country have mobilised to ensure universal access to food in the face of an unfolding hunger crisis. The crisis is proving just how important a national food service is. Never has reliable access to good food been so important. Never has the precarity of our current food system been so clear. Yet there are still so many communities that we still haven't reached, where food insecurity, social isolation and social inequality remain significant issues. The National Food Service has benefited hugely from the involvement of the academic community in the past few months. It takes a lot of thinking to build an entire new public system able to tackle some of society's biggest issues, which is not dependent on the current consumption practices. In this webinar, we will hear from 3 prestigious academics across the country who have greatly supported the NFS in the past few years to hear about why their research proves how we desperately need a national food service. So first up, we have Dr. Megan Blake, a senior year lecturer in human geography at the University of Sheffield. Megan is a recognised expert in the field of food security and food justice. She has an established reputation for her research focusing on the 3 connecting strands of surplus food chains and practices of redistribution, community organisation, social innovation and self-organisation, and practices of resilience and social inequalities. Megan works closely with local and national scale organisations, as well as local authorities, to ensure her research achieves real impact and societal change. Megan has been a keen supporter of the National Food Service since the network began in 2018, strongly advocating the power of bringing communities together around the table to share food and building strong resilience from within the communities themselves. So she's just going to talk a bit more about why her research proves the real need for a national food service.
All right, hello everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen, which hopefully will work. Ah, there we go. Can everybody see that? If a thumbs up would be brilliant. Excellent. All right, thank you. So my name is Megan Blake. I am a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Sheffield. I've been working on food for about 15 years now, but particularly around food insecurity in low-income communities for maybe the last 8 or 9. My research focuses on foodscapes, the kind of built places where we access food, and how we can redesign them to meet the food, social, and economic needs of those who live with them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how my research, which is a systematic kind of view, aims to improve those landscapes and how a national food service fits in that. I've also been doing, as you might imagine, with COVID, been doing quite a bit of work with local authorities and national scale charities and even local charities to kind of get through this COVID process. And so I'm going to share a little bit of learning from that as well. All right, so hopefully that'll work. So one of the things, my research draws on ethnographic, qualitative, and also some quantitative work with a whole range across the whole piece, from producers to commercial retailers to food redistributors to community organizations to people who eat the food. I can engage across that whole area, and broadly, I've tried to develop a framework on that sort of system approach to try to understand how we might redesign those community spaces. So I've developed something called the food ladders approach, which is a multi-scaled approach to everyday food insecurity and community resilience. The focus of this approach is primarily at the local and hyper-local level, so city level and within neighborhood scale. And I fully acknowledge, as I say this, that we do need national level change to things like welfare systems, to the way our food system operates, and how DEFRA and national government conceptualizes food within their systems. There is no space within national government that ensures that people can eat properly. So I get that there's a national level thing, but other people are working more on that at that level, and I'm much more interested in this sort of local scale. So specifically with the food ladders framework that I've developed is about mobilizing the more than nutrient and calorie or commercial aspects of food such that it has its capacity to bring people together. Food is more than nutrients and calories or some sort of form of profit. It's really about how we can connect together. Food is, I hear over and over again, food brings people in the door, and then you can do so much more once you're there. Food has commensal qualities as well, and we have a tendency to forget that. So the social aspect of food is really, really important. Food Ladder seeks to create safe, inclusive spaces for experimentation and interaction with food. One of the things that I hear over and over again is people who are on very low incomes don't have the affordance, the ability to make mistakes. They cannot afford to waste food. They cannot afford to have something not be good. They can't afford to not like it because that's wasteful. And so one of the things about things like the National Food Service is it creates those spaces where people can try things and it's okay not to like them and they're not any worse off. This work is really underpinned by an asset-based approach. So it's really about using positive language, not looking at need or want, but actually trying to build capacity and create transformation by recognizing and acknowledging the assets, and that's a bit of an academic term, I guess, or an economistic term, but the assets that people have. And by assets, I mean their willingness and their connections with their friends and their care for each other, and the fact that they have strong community ties, to bring those to bear on how we reframe our foodscape. And it's really about the hyper-local scale, which I mentioned already. So just starting, I'm going to talk a little bit about everyday food insecurity briefly. Food insecurity is not just about not being able to access food based on the ability to afford. Food insecurity is actually bigger than that. It's about the emotional aspects and the stress that comes from having to make a meal out of stuff that you've managed to cobble together because it's cheap. It's about the social aspects. It's about not being able to, if you can't afford to buy food, you can't afford to socialize. It's about physical access. So one of the things we've seen in COVID, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute, is this thing that there have been people who have been food insecure because they don't have friends who can actually go and buy the food for them. It's not clinical need that's preventing them from accessing food. It's the fact that they don't have good, strong social networks that enable them to rely on their neighbors to go and do that shopping for them. There are cultural constraints, and of course there's a lack of autonomy. People who are of very low income do not have the ability to make the choices that they want about the food that they want, including they're not able to make those choices to buy the good food, the nutritious food that makes them, that they want to buy, that we all want to buy for our families. So food insecurity makes it particularly difficult for particular groups. And my work focuses specifically on low-income groups, but there are other examples, to enjoy a diet that sustains their health and their well-being in everyday life. And what we've seen during COVID is that those communities that are food insecure are also more vulnerable to shocks. And I'd just like to point out there are two levels of food insecurity. There's severe food insecurity, and these are the folk who have no money and no way to get to the shop to get food, so there is no food. And then there's a moderately food insecure, which links much more to worry or cutting back or trading down on the food quality that they have. So I just want to also define this notion of a foodscape, which is a big feature of my work. I'm a geographer, so of course it would be. These are the produced geographical contexts within which we source food and eat. And that's a kind of a balance between the logics of the market. So food is only available within a marketplace, within the commercial landscape, if it is profitable and meets that bottom line of either profitability or shareholder value. And it will be withdrawn if it's food items will be withdrawn if they are not meeting that threshold. And that's a function of a capitalist food system, the current late capitalist food system that we have. So it is withdrawn, and we can see that. We can see that in examples of stores going into a place and then starting off thinking, yeah, we'll provide all these fruit and vegetables, and then slowly and slowly it's about this much space in the shop, and it includes a couple of kind of nasty carrots and maybe an apple or two. The other side of that, so that's the supply side, and the other side of that is the demand side. And of course, the demand side also helps create this environment. So if you can't afford to buy food, you're going to be risk adverse to those things that are going to go off because they're in your household budget. That's not very helpful. Fruit and veg goes off much faster than frozen food. There's also, as people get used to eating foods that they can afford, that are safer, that are less risky, they lose knowledges about what foods are. I have been in communities where people have said, yeah, none of the kids know what grapes are. Well, why would they? Grapes are really expensive. So, and they go off quickly, and they're not going to feed you and fill you up. So people just walk on by that stuff because it's not within the remit. There's also issues about domestic preferences. You want things that are going to make, if you don't have money for a holiday, you're going to try to take your holidays in the food that you eat. So you're going to look for food that makes you feel happy. And then there's also poor relationships with food. So if you're stressed out trying to produce food that's going to feed your family and make them full and not have them coming back to you, the mealtime becomes a horrible experience. And then what happens is that this translates into a geographical sense. It makes itself manifest in the landscape, and we see people with very narrow diets. We see increases of diet-related illness. We see low availability of certain kinds of food, which are better for us, and which is also really limits potential for change. So even if you wanted to go and buy fruits and vegetables or become vegetarian in some of these landscapes, because of this earlier relationship, they're just not available for you, and it makes it impossible to engage with those notions, let alone engage with ideas of buying local or of contributing to the environmental issues around diet diversity, for example, which are known to link or which have been linked to global warming. So food insecurity has these kind of landscape effects. One of the things I wanted to kind of highlight is how this has also kind of been made clearer. It's not something that has been, is not new to COVID, but it's been made clearer with COVID. So previous to COVID, we were focusing on notions of food insecurity that were related very specifically to income inability to buy food. And that's what that sort of top graph is, about mild and then moderate and then severe food insecurity. But in COVID, we also saw another group emerging who became food insecure, and these have to do with the clinical insecurity. And clinical insecurity was defined as those people who had to self-isolate. Now, what we saw in that, and what we are continuing to see, and I've been working with Manchester Council on some of this, collecting data and so forth, is that 25% of those people who are shielding or self-isolating, only 25% needed actually free food, despite that was the government focus. Most of those people could afford, 75% could afford to buy their own food. They didn't need free food. What they needed was some sort of delivery, which means if you look back a little bit, and if we look at the Food Foundation data, people with strong social ties did not need to rely on these sorts of interventions to deliver food to them. So if you have strong social connections, the resilience in the light of this situation would not have been would have been stronger. On the other hand, 100% of those people who are already food insecure because of income, and the additional 3 million people who signed up for universal credit, who ended up in that space, needed food support, and yet they were not within the clinical vulnerable category, and they were not being given free food through government schemes, although there were a whole host of local schemes, including Food Hall, who provided food in this way. But this has all been much more local, this dealing with the income inequality issue as opposed to the health inequality, social inequality aspect. So I just want to point out that food is, this is really shown and brought to the foreground, that food is not just, food access access is not just about being able to afford the food, it's also about having social ties. All right, so I did a bit of research in the autumn with an organization called the Bread and Butter Thing in Greater Manchester. And we asked them a number of questions that, based on research that I have done previously, that sort of, and others have done previously, that indicate that this kind of notion of social value in food redistribution or food support. And it's one of the things that people said sort of anecdotally is, oh yeah, I've gotten to try new things, or oh yeah, I've made new friends, or oh yeah, I feel a lot more confident. But we wanted to test that. And one of the things about the Bread and Butter Thing, it operates across Greater Manchester. It serves about 8,000 people across the city, or across the collective cities. And they're largely targeted in low income areas. And it gave us a big enough pool of responses to actually survey and try to get some quantitative data behind the qualitative stuff that we were finding. There was lots in that survey that sort of illustrate diet diversity and other things, but I want to pull out the social aspect here. And one of the things, so the average householder in the UK, amongst the population of the UK, about 5% of the total population of adults in the UK report being lonely or feeling isolated and alone. What we found in this result, in just going and collecting a food bag from a community organization, 41% said they made new friends as a result of standing in the queue to go collect their food bags. And these are new friends in their neighborhood who are also collecting food bags. So 41% is quite a significant, and it's quite significantly bigger. We also found, as an outcome, 41% feel less alone, which is actually a result of this. So this project is reducing isolation and feelings of loneliness. If 41% feel less alone, that's significantly more than the 5% of the national population, which suggests that low income is a contributor to notions of loneliness. Loneliness is important because it's mental health issues and because loneliness feels kind of sucky. But actually, it's important from a collective perspective because we spend in the NHS about $2 billion, a little less than £2 billion a year addressing issues around loneliness. People who are socially connected live better longer with the illnesses that they have. They are able to rely on each other in times of strife. It's really an important thing, one that's often overlooked. We also found things like people are more connected to their neighbors and they know their neighbors. A good proportion of them are volunteering, and many are going on and using the other services that this particular relationship that this food provider has with community organizations, which is quite important. In low-income communities, people tend not to volunteer in a formal sense, and the fact that there's increased volunteering and increased use of those services to get them through really means something. All right, so that's the kind of context and the problem. How do we solve that issue? And so I've been thinking really hard and looking at different examples across the country where people are trying to improve and move away from either you go to a food bank and get free food and feel stigmatized, or you go to the commercial sector and you end up not being able to afford to buy the food, or trading down in sort of your diet. And how do we support people to move up so that they're able to have better sense of well-being? How are they able to cope with the crisis that they might be in, or the bigger national crisis that we find ourselves? How we can build capacity to be able to understand food, to be able to make friendships, because that's not very easy. And how do we develop economics capability? So really this kind of middle rung of the ladder is about reducing stigma and doing with people, and enabling accessible choices that they can learn and experiment and fail with, because failure is also an important thing. And the final rung is really how do we reach its position where we're able to transform the foodscape? And by transformation, I mean diversity. How do we diversify what we have and what our offer is? How do we catch people before they fall, all the way down to that point where they need catching? How do we intercede before they end up in that pit where they need people to do for them? Because it's much harder to climb out of the hole if you're already at the bottom than if you're caught partway up. So the ladder's idea is about improving in 3 areas: food relationships, social relationships, and economic relationships, to improve well-being for people in place to create a more diversified foodscape that meets their different needs. And bear in mind here, people might be on different rungs, on different ladders. Capacity is about enhancing capability, realizing the assets that people have, and where each person feels they need it. So it's not about imposing, it's about working with. And it starts absolutely from a position that everybody has assets. One of the things that happens with need-based approaches is that people become defined by their needs, and what they bring to the table is ignored. And really, what we need to do is start with, what can you bring and how can we help you enhance that? So I'm not going to go through this whole slide. I realize there's a whole lot of text there. I'll just talk long enough for it to be on the video. The bold bits on this slide are kind of how I see the National Food System or National Food Service fitting within this wider framework. And again, it's across 3 domains: food, social, and economic, which I've tried to pull out. And it's about catching, capacity building, and transforming. We cannot expect people who are at the very bottom and desperate to have the energy and the ability and the mental space and the social space to be able to achieve and start learning and moving along and being self-organized from the beginning. We need to catch them and give them a moment of pause and rest. But really, as quickly as we can, we need to move them, or help them move to that next stage of doing with and building. So there's a whole host of activities that are example, but social eating is certainly one that increases the social and food and economic abilities of people to begin to engage more positively and contribute to building the foodscapes that they want in the places where they live. All right, so just to summarize a little bit, where does the National Food Service fit in with this? Well, social eating builds capacity in food, social, and economic domains. It builds capacity in terms of stretching people's understanding of what counts as food. They get to try new things in a way that is not difficult for them or causes anxiety. They're able to meet new people in an ordered and structured way, so that then they can form friendships and go on and do that in a self-organized way. And that certainly contributes also to economic domains, particularly through volunteering and through the additional kind of activities that begin to appear within the space. The National Food Service helps people move up the food ladder as well. So it's not just about keeping them in a place, which oftentimes you find with some food support, particularly food bank support. You're given your 3 things, you get those, and you're sent out the door. What it does is it helps people move into an opportunity to be able to volunteer, to give their skills, to be able to engage, to start cooking, those sorts of things, which in and of itself increases or moves towards transformation, but also increases social resilience because those friendships are forged in place. In the longer term, social eating also enhances foodscapes by offering opportunities that can enable people to engage positively with the foodscape in a way that's low risk and which can ultimately lead to a transformed foodscape that meets the food, social, and economic needs of all residents, regardless of their income or their ethnicity or their social economic status. All right, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much. If you want more, I have a website called geofoodie.org, which I put on videos, and I have expanded discussion about the food ladders approach and other bits of thinking that I've done. So please come visit that. And also my Twitter handle is down there at the bottom. If you want to tweet me, I'm always happy to talk to people about what they're doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Megan. It's really great to hear about your research in more detail and also to see how relevant it is to the campaign work and the on-the-ground work that we're doing. So next up, we've got Marsha Smith. With 10 years working in award-winning community food initiatives, having founded the Nottingham Super Kitchen, Marsha Smith really understands and works to enable the wonders of eating communally, using surplus food to tackle both food insecurity and food wastage simultaneously. She is currently undertaking a PhD in social eating at Coventry University and is a visiting fellow at Nottingham Trent University, as well as an academic advisor to Food Hall, our Sheffield branch of the National Food Service. So over to you, Marsha.
Okay, right. Can everybody hear me talking now? I'm just going to see how I get my PowerPoint presentation up here. I think it's here. Okay, let me bring that up. Okay, let me go back to the start of my presentation. Right, can everybody see that? Yeah? Okay, right, so I'm sort of here to talk about social eating, and a lot of the stuff that I'm doing sort of intersects with what Megan has said before. I'm interested in sort of the National Food Service and how that intersects with social eating, particularly in terms of its ongoing strategy, and that's where I think I can be of service today. To give you some context, my interest is in the sort of three intersecting issues that we're having at the moment in UK society, which is food insecurity, coexisting with food wastage, but also the destructuration of the mealtime, so the diminishment of the shared mealtime. And I think those things are intersecting to create a particular type of society, and that in response to that, they are shaping particular forms of commensality or food sharing or group eating practices. And that's what my research is about, and I'm going to talk through that now. And I'm going to just frame the National Food Service within this more than food movement, which again, as Megan has said, is really about trying to, move the sort of commodified, transactional, individual consumption of foodstuffs back into its social setting, and reframe why food is important to people and that it can do a lot more than just feed us nutritionally. So really briefly, I'm going to talk about food insecurity, something that probably many of you already know about if you're interested in National Food Service. And my main issue is that really the current narrative at the moment individualises the problem of food insecurity. And we are expected within this neoliberal discourse to really be rational, choosing actors who have full responsibility for our budget, for our diet, for where we buy food and how we cook and serve food. We're expected to cook everything from scratch, healthily, and all these different things. And actually, I think that's really problematic for a number of people. And actually, the individualisation of the problem actually also makes it difficult to mobilise social movements. And what we actually require at the moment is a social movement rather than an individual consumption movement. And as Megan has said before, if you're food insecure in its most instrumental sense, you can't afford to access food, or you have issues with the affordability and availability of food. But actually broadening that definition to include social ties and social life. If you can't afford to eat, you can't afford to socialise around food. And actually socialising around food or commensality is this really important social engine that does much more than feed us. So when we're excluded from those types of practices, it's really problematic for society in general. And what this has led to is this sort of individualisation gives rise to a number of what I call sort of poverty proxies. And again, I'm not problematising them, but I'm saying that things like food banks, social supermarkets and food pantries tend to reproduce this idea that what we're trying to restore is not just income, but also the sort of opportunity for people to consume in conventional ways. And again, I think it's not about criticising those, but it's about broadening the offer to say that actually social eating spaces add value to this foodscape, as Megan has said, because they offer something other than just a transactional model, and they just offer something in terms of the commodification of food, more about the sort of social aspects of food. So again, I'm not problematising these poverty proxies, but I'm saying actually at a community level, there's a lot more going on, and that's where my research interest is. And then we're looking at food waste, industrial levels of food waste, and I think it's really important that the one point I want to make here is that currently we frame surplus food as waste food, and to me that's really problematic. Materially within the surplus food sector within the last 10 years, there's been an enormous change, and there's huge volumes of very high quality and large quantities of good quality surplus that are moving. And it's really important for us to move away from this framing of surplus as waste, because what it does is it others it, and it makes it something that people don't want to eat, and it makes it a problem for poor people having to consume waste food. And instead, National Food Service is really about reimagining surplus food to say that it's a civic opportunity for us all to engage in socialising around food that would have otherwise been wasted. And I also think really fundamentally what my research is showing is that when people experience surplus food cooked into meals, that really mobilises them into thinking about surplus more broadly, and it moves it away from this thing which is just something that is someone else's problem. So again, I think that experiential aspect of eating together and eating surplus together is really important. And again, my research is really interested in the destructuration of the mealtime. Again, there's various research saying whether this is really happening or not, whether we are really struggling to eat together more broadly, or whether that is just a sort of a common social anxiety. And why that's seen as a social anxiety is that social eating and commensality is like a social engine or a social barometer. So across time and space, when you look at the way that people eat together in groups, it tells you an awful lot about the way that that society is organised, and also what people value in that society at that time. So again, if you're going to attach your strategic campaign to something, commensality is a really fantastic bedrock for that type of campaigning, because it's about what we have in common rather than something that which is either we're excluded from or something that we actually don't want to be part of, such as food poverty or food wastage. And again, when we look at the UK situation, we've got the highest level of consumption of ready meals in all of Europe. And again, that can be seen as really problematic in terms of single-use plastics and in terms of junk food. But actually what convenience food and sort of ready meals that can be microwaved, for example, also tell us is that commensality is really important, and people are using these technologies to enable them to still engage in commensality, which tells us that actually underneath all of these moves towards sort of ready meal consumption or junk food consumption, actually people are still want to maintain commensality, that they still see eating together in groups as really important, which again tells us this is a really potent mechanism that's of strategic importance to the National Food Service. As I'm moving on to my research on social eating initiatives, so again, I've undertaken a load of qualitative research, a number of different methods to really get a rich picture of what's going on in social eating initiatives, particularly in Nottingham. And I'm really interested in how social eating initiatives are valued by the participants, and that includes stakeholders, producers of social eating initiatives, and their consumers. Because I'm interested in understanding why these spaces are important, why they're valued by people. And again, that's given fantastic insights that could be useful to the National Food Service campaign. So I talk about commensality as being sort of the inevitability of commensality. So rather than this sort of top-down linear cause and effect of austerity, and then you get this proliferation of community food services, when we look across time and space, we will see that in all cultures there are forms of commensality, which tells us it's a really important mechanism for social inclusion, actually social exclusion as well, but social inclusion. So it's almost like this sort of engine of social life. So actually commensality is inevitable, and social eating is inevitable in UK society, but it is actually shaped by these broader social issues to do with food insecurity, but not necessarily fully determined by them. And again, this is interesting for me because what it says is that actually there is a huge amount that's happening at the level of community. There's a huge amount of agency and resistance and solidarity that's occurring at those levels, and it's not just down this sort of linear picture of a top-down cause and effect. And social eating, I guess you could call it homemade meals in public places. So again, I envisage it as a new form of commensality where there are elements of domestic life that get transposed into public settings, like eating out and a paid for meal, but a cheap, affordable meal that's made from surplus. So this is almost like a hybrid form of commensality that's emerging, that's really, really indicative of the particular social situation that we find ourselves in. And again, it's attaching to something which is much deeper and more persistent, which to me gives us better opportunities to strategize about how we create a movement around social eating. And my research particularly looks at social practices, and the research that I've done about trying to understand the value of social eating. I've asked people about the sort of the space and the places, and there's all sorts of stuff that people are doing in social eating spaces. And I've identified 3 sort of broad forms of practice, which actually, again, I'm trying to highlight these here because they're applicable more broadly to the National Food Service and not just to sort of to these, but also there are opportunities to engage much more broadly with diverse audiences and not just the traditional food insecure. So eating together, not surprisingly, is really, really valued by participants. And this new form of commensality, as I've shown the picture here, where people are sitting in large tables and eating together, is seen as really, really valuable. Social eating initiatives also enable people to engage in what I call alimentary contribution. So helping out before, during and after the meal. So there's a wide variety of opportunities, not just to volunteer, but also by things like buying a meal or paying it forward, or by talking to someone and giving them advice, or by helping somebody, welcoming them as they come through the door. There's a huge amount of opportunities for people to participate and engage. So again, it's not just the passive receipt of charitable food aid, it's the social engagement and participation through commensality. And the third practice that I've identified is to do with socialising, again, perhaps not surprisingly, what I call performances of care. So people are able to feel cared for and express caring for other people and nurturance beyond traditional kinship groups. So again, just for a couple of hours a week, when Megan talks about holidaying with food, social eating spaces are places where just for a couple of hours a week, people don't have to worry about what to cook or whether to do the washing up or what's on the menu. They can just turn up and have a really relaxing social experience where they can engage or not, or they can just consume a meal. Those practices really intersect to create an enormous sort of system of values and a set of practices within social eating spaces that are really valuable for participants. And I sort of term this type of my research approach as a form of like invitational sociology. So I'm not criticising the sort of veracity or significance of a lot of the other academic work that's been done in this sort of sector. But in some ways, in revealing the problems that people are having, I'm interested in revealing the sort of opportunities that people are creating and mobilising. I want to create a form of sort of sociological knowledge through my research, which shows where people can engage and where they can find commonality with other people. And so I think this is a much more powerful opportunity to, create a social movement, is to focus on the things that all people would like to do, and it's good for everybody to eat together in groups. So it's not just waste food for poor people, it's not just a charitable food service, it's a civic opportunity to engage and around sort of shared food, about the revivification of social space. And so there's lots of things there that are really positive, which creates this sort of invitation for people to engage, rather than something that they think, isn't it awful? I don't want to be like that, and I hope it never happens to me. So this is, in terms of campaigning, I think this is much more powerful. So in terms of a national food service, I really see the food service sitting within this more than food movement that Megan has also talked about, which is really about saying that this sort of commercial, transactional commodification of food, where we're treated as these rational individual consumers, and that we can engage in society based upon the products and services that we can afford to use, really misses what actually people value. And it's about making that distinction between how much something costs and what its value is. And I think this is the more than food movement is trying to put meals and commensality and the social aspects of food sharing back into the centre of social life. And actually, in terms of campaigning, as I've said, that we're drawing upon a really potent social phenomenon, which is commensality. We're attaching this campaign to something which is really deep-seated and important, and also has really broad appeal. National Food Service, again, is looking at multiple issues. So it's not just looking at this instrumental hunger in terms of calories, it's actually looking at the way that social space intersects with, food security, intersects with food insecurity, with food wastage, for example. It's looking at all of those things, and it's recognising that people might want to engage in social eating for a whole range of reasons, and actually that they can do those. You don't have to have one type of customer, you can have a whole variety of participation based upon people's sort of interest in environmental issues, for example. And it really, what it also does is it locates agency within communities. So it's saying that actually, and again, the pandemic really exposed here that people weren't just fed by these sort of globalized food chains, they were fed and cared for by their local communities. And actually, again, as Megan has said, what COVID revealed was that there were lots of people that might have had money, but they were still really vulnerable. And actually also we have a whole load of people that have come across community food services for the first time ever, and have really seen the enormous value that these community food services have. And obviously this is where we're seeing the amplification of the work that National Food Service is doing. So again, I think it's really important. So it's not the passive receipt of food aid. These are vibrant social spaces where there's a huge amount of sort of agency, solidarity and resistance being manifested, often in non-political ways, what I call sort of quiet participation or quiet activism. And lastly, my last slide is just thinking about social eating and national food services as part of these sort of future food practices, and sort of just about a few things I want you to take away from this presentation is that, not just COVID-19 and the lockdown, but also the we're starting to go into recession in terms of climate change and food security. Careful stewardship of the planetary resources in terms of food, fuel, and energy are going to become, water, are going to become even more important. And actually, rather than seeing it as something that is like like a soup kitchen energy that people don't really want to go there, it's actually about building a vibrant social movement of places that people want to go to, where they actually feel at some level they can make a difference and they can actually actively participate. And these are all really tangible, practical ways of beginning to address some of these much bigger, often intangible and often quite intimidating problems. And also fundamentally, National Food Service and all the different branches, and my research with social eating, has really demonstrated that food is about pleasure, it's about socialising, it's about caring for each other. And actually they're forms of really powerful resistance that pull people together rather than push them apart. And I think, centering pleasure and socialising and caring within the sort of manifesto of National Food Service is a really sort of smart strategic move. And also I think that we've seen now, I guess in my local area, Nottingham, we had both public, corporate and charitable link-ups for the first time in some ways. So again, we had supermarkets supplying food, we had restaurants cooking it, and we had charitable groups disseminating it. So the idea that those three aspects of society can work together has been demonstrated here. And I think more broadly, some of the stuff that I'm interested in, just to finish, is looking at social eating cities. So again, having broader access to social eating spaces. So just once a week you can go and eat at a social eating space, but there might be a number of them across your city. And I think this might be one first step that we can take into manifesting the right to food. So it seems like a hugely sort of abstract concept in some ways, but just having the right to be able to go and eat a really affordable social meal with other people and make your sort of contribution might be one place to start. So I think that was really sort of useful to the National Food Service strategy and campaign. All right, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marsha. That was so interesting. Yeah, I really agree with the idea that this is a universal thing, and I really do agree that, the more people hear about us, you can't not agree with what we're doing.
Yeah.
So next up, we've got Sharon Lulin, who is both a policy researcher and community organiser. She's currently a visiting lecturer of sociology at City University London. Building on 20 years' experience of food policy, in 2018 she gained her PhD from City University London for qualitative critical research in food-related obesity policy, parents and class, a critical policy analysis exploring disconnect. Prior to this, Sharon holds 10 years' experience as an NHS dietitian, specialising in child obesity, and 20 years' experience organising 4 grassroots campaigns spanning domestic violence, housing and justice in her community. Sharon is currently organising with Food Inequalities Rebellion, a London-based group of food and nutrition activists organising to influence policy through activism. Over to you, Shannon.
Okay, thank you, thanks. I'll just try and share the screen then. Okay. Right, okay. Hi, hello again. Well, I think hopefully what I'm going to say builds on nicely to what Megan and Marsha have brilliantly outlined. In my contribution tonight, I was just going to draw on some of my own PhD research and some of the work that's been built following the PhD research. And so, as Selena said, the PhD was a qualitative critical policy analysis, and I'll speak briefly about that, and then briefly about the some of the work I've been doing during COVID and after. Why isn't it moving? So bear with me. Right. So my PhD was carried out in the London Borough of Lewisham in 2014. It was carried out in the sort of setting of the local state, so that through the local state I could use it as a means of looking at the world of parents, of working class parents, and how they are situated between policymakers, who are the local councillors, policy implementers, who'll be people like myself as a dietitian and others, and then themselves as policy recipients. And I called them that particularly because of the question of power relations that exists within the foods, within the food within the local government, local state and food systems. So, and in looking at using a critical analysis, it's where do you begin and where do you end, because there is so much theory that could be used. And so using a class analysis and questions of power, I particularly drew on theorists that looked at class, that looked at power relations, soft power relations, and also began to look at feminist economics as well. And so they're just some of the theorists that I drew upon: Marx, Gramsci, Foucault, Bourdieu, and Bev Skeggs. And that tower block is my tower block, and that was one of the areas in which, and I'm still active in that area in the work that I do. The PhD looked at disconnects. It's looking at disconnects between the social reality of the working class parents and food and health policy as it played out in the remit of the local state. There was 5 areas that were found according to the experiences of the parents, of the caregivers that I spoke to. These were around the material conditions. The people I interviewed are mostly women, bus drivers, childcare workers, women in adult social care. The key questions they drew out was about their material conditions, was about class differences were apparent, particularly about the lived reality of difference of class, the meanings of food and class, and the discrimination, the stigmatisation and discrimination that takes place toward working class communities, and also within working class communities. The idea of responsibilities was a strong disconnect. It was about power relations that unfold through policy, through food policy and through health policy, and how that positions parents through responsibilising parents, particularly through privatisation and charitisation of food and health services, of public services. Then there's a greater responsibilisation of parents, through which parents become stigmatised, but they also internalise and self-blame. They stigmatise the biases they experience through being parents of higher weight children, and internalise that, but that in turn also turns into resistance. There was this disconnect in the local states around the ideas of local government, of where they compromised. They were compromised into making spending cuts, but there was also disconnects around urban planning policy, and those disconnects were in contrast to the protection of child's health that they were meant to be protecting, but in reality that wasn't taking place. And part of the process within that was a question of democracy deficit that occurs within the local state, that makes it very difficult for a connection to begin with working class communities. In terms of what working class parents said they wanted, then it is basically it was virtually the opposite to what was happening around government policy. Their answers to food policy were based on their own, improving their own sort of economic and social rights, redesigning their local high streets, including around having family clubs for them to eat, and that also they should be meaningfully involved in food policy making. So this just gives you a little bit of a taste of how parents looked at their communities and other people's communities. So this is a mum, Felicia, who's a playground supervisor. She's looking at a picture of a supermarket in a more affluent area, and there she says, that looks pretty, that looks more healthy, it looks like a health food shop, it's not life-threatening. So as a mum of a child of a higher weight child, then obviously what she sees her community is something that is life-threatening on her child. And this is the voice of another mother and another childminder, who, when looking at these pictures of her community, says it's keeping the adults on the liquor, the kids on the sweets. The takeaways for dinner is what we're seeing every day. So all we think about is sweets and drinks. It's like the betting shops. There's so many and people are doing it a lot more. It's not good. And so people in class were very aware. Once they had an opportunity to think, they were aware of the discrimination that was taking place through these foodscapes, and it becomes something about fixing in class, that through policies that enable this to take place and through these experiences happening, then it's a fixing of people in place in class. Again, from the local government's position, they would argue that it was a question of the cuts. Therefore, they closed down children's centres from the parents' perspectives. Then again, it just added to the running down of their high streets and the lack of support that was there for them in their communities. In terms of what this meant in terms of governing parents, of governing parents' practices and what they do, then it boiled down to ideas around hegemony and governmentalities, which included the question of volunteering, because most of these parents, including bus driver mums who are working split shifts, were volunteering in their communities, and they didn't have the time to do this, but they did because of their collective care toward their community and their collective care toward children in their community. But there, this bus driver mum says it, that we're the ones who are doing it, we're the volunteers, and they're doing that as children's centres close, as means of commensality close. It's working class people in particular who step in to fill the gaps. In terms of what this meant for some of these parents around owning their communities, food sovereignty and democracy, then people were very aware about what comes into their communities. They used terms like muck on the shelves, food's being dumped in their communities, and the visions that they had was of things being very, very different. And part of this included getting rid of the middleman, starting a food revolution. What does that mean? It means change, not being told what to do, not being told how food should be. So working class women, and it was an example of 15 working class women across an incredible range of ethnicity because of the makeup of London. Then these are the sort of things that were being said. And so the idea here is that, can we have food democracy without having local democracy? What can we do, even through a national food service at local level, if we haven't got local control? And so can we divorce what we argue for within a food system? Can we divorce that from ideas of democracy? And so that was one of the questions that came out of my work, and particularly within that, what is the role of the trade? What is the role of the trade unions? That historically the trade unions have played a role in social nutrition, in school meals and so on. So why isn't that now? And this is just one sort of snippet of the ideas that came from the PhD, of one sort of portrayal of it. And it was about having a people-centred food policy, that we need to include a parent's perspective. We need an ecological approach across the whole food system, but also we need an ethic of care. A political ethic of care needs to be central to food and health policies. And that type of idea is rooted in history. It's rooted in the economics of other communities. It's rooted in Indigenous people, and it's rooted in struggles. And part of coming out of my PhD is, what do? You can either put it on the shelf or you put it to action. And so putting a PhD to action for me meant linking up with like-minded dietitians, nutritionists, food activists around where do we go. And so we looked at where do we go, and we set up the Food Inequalities Rebellion last year, which is London based, because you can't take on the world at this moment. So it's London based, and trying to particularly look at the questions around privatisation and charitisation of social and community and public health nutrition, of people like myself, dietitians who are made redundant, who we are privatised. Our work then becomes, we are forced into charity, and so the professionals are forced down the charity route as volunteers for NGOs that are being set up, for new charities that are being set up. So that's one of the things that we're looking at at through this project that came out of the PhD is based on the free food ideas of the Black Panther Party, which their issue was all around commensality. It was around using food as a means to politically organise people. It's about the right to food, the right particularly of children to food, and then through that, how do you organise people politically about their food rights? And so bringing people to food, it was about their rights to food, and so these are just pictures of the Panther Party that you can see in their books and online. Also, that's come through Food Inequalities Rebellion. There's been one piece of research we've done as a group, has been for the Fit and Healthy Childhood parliamentary group. But this would be interviewed again working class mothers around the changes to children's dietary habits during COVID, and that showed similar to the other research that's been done, that there was the combination of the existing food insecurity, lockdown, anxiety was a complete disaster for many families, and it impacted on the diets of children, which can potentially have future impacts on them going forward. But a key question here was what happened locally, as Marsha and Megan has said, and it's the question in my community was the local social supermarket, and it was a community solidarity that's provided in that enabled some of the mums that we interviewed to maintain some dignity, was the words they used. So further developing this work, it's where do we go from here? And so one of the things that we've now I've linked up with is universities of Westminster and Chester, thinking about what is the future of public health nutrition, given the level of privatisation and the level of charitisation that has taken place within the food system that isn't going away, that is getting bigger by the day with Dido and Henry coming in, then they are going to, the charitisation and it will speed up as it did during COVID. And so the question is now for us, what is public health nutrition? How do we tie it all together? How do we build, something that comes from the academics within dietetics, within sociology, and within the community around around public needs and food in all its social nutrition in all its ways. And so this is just a survey we've got going now that is still taking place, but it is trying to bring out the idea that we have to fight for public health nutrition. Public health is being privatised, but the idea of who owns food, the idea of where does food sit within public health is a key question. It shouldn't sit with charity, it shouldn't sit with the NGOs. It's a key, feeding people is an absolutely key question, and it's a key question for me, for the trade unions. And so in the labour movement, this is a picture of the miners' wives going back to 1985. How we feed in our communities is it's the essence of our communities. And so the question about what role do the NGOs play, and I think we do need to, not just the NGOs but the third sector organisations, we need to think, what is their role, and what are the issues around food rights, social rights. What is food democracy in terms of local democracy and developing local food economies, and so on, and particularly looking at the question of class and connecting our food rights as class issues. This last slide is Grenfell, which is probably one of the best pictures you can get of collective food and care of a community through food. And as you can see here, this is free food, and it's provided by Ahmed, who lived in Grenfell Tower. But in struggle and in protest, they provide free food for people who go on the monthly protests. So, in summary, it's my research centres on working class approach to food and collective approaches to food that is probably is there within our communities. It is there throughout history, and it's something that I think we need to bring back in when we look at everything around food and public health nutrition. And that's where I think working with the NFS is a key way forward. So that's a new area, trade. Trade. So yeah, Brexit end of year trade is a key question. What's going to happen in our communities, and what do we do? And so that's just that's me. Thank you, and my contact details. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. That was really interesting. I feel like we haven't properly considered the intersection between public health and food insecurity enough within the National Food Service Group as it currently exists. So it's really interesting to hear a bit more about it. We've slightly overrun, so I'm afraid that we don't actually have time for questions, but we're thinking that we could do, if people have questions, if they tweet National Food, then we can share them with the relevant person and hopefully start the conversation online a bit further. But thank you everyone for coming. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you to all the speakers. And we've got another one next Thursday about the future of the National Food Service, speaking to key players who have been founders of the movement and also other key players part of like the agricultural movement and government policy. So look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Lena. Thanks. Where's the chat?